Oh look, IGN found a Tolkien expert to praise Amazon's new show that everyone hates. Careful, Amazon. Your desperation is showing. I think it's fair to say that at this point, Amazon underestimated how much Tolkien fans would dislike their changes to his work. I suspect they thought some fans wouldn't like it, but I doubt they thought it'd go over so badly that they'd have to unlist videos due to downvoting and negative comments. Most of the backlash comes from fans stating that the changes aren't true to Tolkien's work. J.r.r. Tolkien said numerous times that the world of Middle-earth was based on English, Norse, and Celtic folklore. It would stand to reason that the people who inhabit Middle-earth wouldn't just share the cultural traits, but also racial appearances of those inspirations. A great example of another story like this is the TV show Avatar: The Last Airbender. Most of the casts are based on Asian cultures, and so their in-world cultures match their real-world counterparts in aesthetics, architecture, and race. Aang looks Tibetan, Zuko looks Japanese, Katara and Sokka look Inuit. However, much like the situation with Amazon's The Rings of Power, that changed when Avatar got adapted to a live-action film. M. Night Shyamalan decided to cast white actors as Katara, Sokka, and Aang, as he called him. He cast non-white actors in the roles of Zuko and Admiral Zhao, the main antagonists of the film. If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, yes. Shyamalan cast white or white-looking actors in the hero roles, and non-white actors as the villains. When it came to the background cast, however, he had no problem casting minorities, so you end up with this weird situation where all the airbenders are non-white except for Aang. The film received backlash from fans and non-fans alike for the apparent whitewashing or race-bending of the characters, partly because Shyamalan is a minority, so it came across as weird that he would alter the race of the characters to make them white, but mostly because it's not true to the lore. These characters are supposed to be Asian, so when casting a live-action adaptation, it's reasonable to expect that the director would choose Asian actors. People expect to see the world of Avatar presented as it was in the show, meaning the actors should either be or be able to pass as Asian. The same holds true for Tolkien's Middle-earth. He based it on Northern European cultures, mostly English culture, and the casting should reflect this. Now, obviously adaptations will have to change some things about the work. Sometimes what works in a novel doesn't work on film. So a personality may be changed, an age may be changed, a location may be changed, time may be lengthened or compressed, but the core of the characters and the world is still expected to be present. Peter Jackson changed a lot in his Middle-earth adaptations, much to many fans and Christopher Tolkien's, J.r.r. Tolkien's son's, disappointment. However, the core of Tolkien's work remained, and the changes mostly worked. And that's because Peter Jackson was less interested in putting his politics and agenda into the film than he was in telling Tolkien's story. As he said in an interview, quote, "We made a promise to ourselves at the beginning of the process that we weren't going to put any of our own politics, our own messages, or our own themes into these movies. In a way, we were trying to make these films for him, Tolkien, not ourselves." That is the most important element to remember when adapting someone's work. You want the fans and the creator to see this work brought to life in a way that feels satisfying, if not correct to their vision. That's not always going to happen. It won't always be possible, but it should be the goal. You should want the creator to recognize their own work, and you should respect them enough to assume that they knew what they were doing when they created that work, so they don't really need you to come in and fix it for them, especially not if the thing you want to fix is the purpose of the story. Tolkien created Middle-earth in part to have people speak the languages he was creating, but also to replace the lost folklore and mythology of England. Due to invasions and French influences, much of England's old mythology had been lost, and the remaining stories associated with English folklore have outsider influences. Tolkien essentially created a thought experiment in which those influences never happened or were staved off. He wove in things like Atlantis, Avalon, and even the song Hey Diddle Diddle into his stories, implying that the stories we know today are altered versions of the true stories. Amazon, however, decided that they were less interested in staying true to Tolkien's words because, quote, "It felt only natural to us that an adaptation of the author's work would reflect what the world actually looks like." The point of Tolkien's stories is to be English in design and effect, and Middle-earth reflects that in its cultures, languages, and the appearance of its races. To change this, to remove the Englishness, or really the whiteness, from Tolkien's stories is to undermine the very purpose of his works. It should be obvious that this will result in a backlash, but for some reason, after watching fans reject every attempt at playing politics with major franchises like Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, and the MCU, Amazon decided to inject progressive politics into their show, along with playing loose and fast with the lore, and were shocked when fans gave them the one-finger salute. So began the apologia, first in interviews from Amazon, then by media outlets, and now by people claiming to be superfans and Lord of the Rings experts. IGN had Corey Olsen, the Tolkien professor, react to Amazon's teaser trailer for The Rings of Power. Olsen has a podcast where he talks about Tolkien's works. I'm not familiar with this podcast and I've only glanced at some of the titles of the videos and segments he's done. I'll give him the benefit of doubt and assume he is indeed an expert. He starts the interview by giving the general setup of Middle-earth and the events that led to the Second Age, showing that he is fairly knowledgeable about the lore. He also brings up the point about Amazon compressing time in the show.
So the Second Age, we're talking about everything that happens in this show, according to Tolkien's chronology, is thousands of years, anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 years before the events of The Lord of the Rings. So millennia and millennia we're talking about here. Now, again, I don't know what they're going to do with the time frame. They're certainly going to compress it because the events that they're going to be describing in this show, according to Tolkien's chronology, take the place over the course of a couple of millennia. And there's no way they can do that.
Sure they can. The show is reportedly going to run for 5 seasons. Amazon could have dedicated each season to a specific event in a Second Age and then do time jumps. If they focused on the Númenóreans, who live for hundreds of years, and the elves, who are immortal, they could keep most of the cast. The other option would have been to pick a key event and just tell that story, such as the forging of the One Ring or the fall of Númenor. They could also do flashbacks to ancient moments they wanted to highlight. This is constantly done in film, and there's no reason it couldn't work here. By compressing thousands of years of time, they create a narrative problem for themselves. The Second Age lasts for 3,441 years. It takes a little over half that time for the Númenóreans to turn against the Valar and Eldar, and most of it before Sauron completely seduces the royal line. The question is how much compression happens, because if it's a lot, it runs the risk of compressing things too much to the point that it doesn't make sense for the Númenóreans to turn against the Valar and the Eldar. Olsen then goes on to talk about the introduction of hobbits.
The first thing that I was amazed by with this is all of the buildup, of course, for the trailer and for the TV show, mostly elves. Well, elves and Númenor, right? Because, of course, those are the stories that we know. We get the perspective of a Middle-earth hobbit perspective. And so this, of course, brings up one of the questions that people have had about, the series. People are like, hobbits in the Second Age, what the heck? And I would just remind people here, there's no reason to think that hobbits didn't exist in the Second Age. It is true that we have no stories of hobbits prior to the Third Age. So the opportunity to get to see hobbits in the Second Age, that's a lot of fun.
No, it's not. Amazon admitted this. They only added in hobbits because everybody likes hobbits. The hobbits have nothing to do with the Second Age. They play no major role. The far more interesting story is the rise and fall of Númenor, the creation of the Rings of Power, and Sauron's seduction of men. They could add the hobbits in as fan service, since at least the Northmen, the ancestors of the Rohirrim, were familiar with them, but it makes no sense to highlight them in the show since they don't factor into the creations of the Rings of Power. You know, the point of the show.
Now you may ask, why? Why would you shoehorn them into the story? Well, keep in mind, the story that we know from Tolkien's materials in the Second Age, again, it's very limited. He never wrote the story of the Second Age. It doesn't exist in Tolkien's writings.
Yes, he did. Twice. Once in the Silmarillion, and once in the appendices of The Return of the King. These weren't full-on dialogue-heavy narratives, but they are stories. I don't know why people keep claiming that they aren't. A story doesn't have to be a 1,600-page standalone novel. It can be a couple of dozen pages long. These still count as stories in the same way that grim fairy tales count as stories.
So, I love Action Galadriel.
Of course you do.
Had a lot of conversations already on social media about this, especially people who know and love the Peter Jackson films have this indelible image of the incredibly regal and elegant Cate Blanchett in her flowing white dress, speaking slowly and in mysterious tones, right, to Frodo. And so the idea of a Galadriel who's jumping around and hanging by her fancy dagger from the ice, wearing chainmail, riding a horse into battle apparently at the head of a squad, it seems jarring. It's my favorite part.
Of course it is. Never mind that the regal, ethereal Galadriel comes from Tolkien's descriptions, not from Peter Jackson. What you see in the films was mostly lifted from the books. Cate Blanchett nails this role, making Galadriel feel ancient and powerful beyond reckoning. The moment you see her, you know she's not to be messed with. With a single look, Blanchett conveys that Galadriel is compassionate and yet so mighty that even a Balrog wouldn't dare challenge her. She did this with a look. No knife, no armor, just a casual glance. You don't have to put a sword in her hand to make her strong. That's also clear in the book. So right there, you're showing that you need to reread them, because you're a little off, but not as off as this.
And here's why people underestimate is how much younger Galadriel was. And she was born a long time before this. So she's already thousands of years old. So she's a few more thousand years old. A lot of people have this idea that elves are frozen. That was not Tolkien's idea of elves at all. Last September was published a book, The Nature of Middle-earth. One of the things that he does a lot of in this book is he talks about elvish ages and aging. And he keeps bringing it back to mortal equivalents. They made age at like 144 years to 1, but they do age. He calculates the exact age of Galadriel, like her maturity level. In the end, decides that at the beginning of the Second Age, in other words, right around where this series is taking place, Galadriel is the mortal equivalent of 21.
No, Tolkien doesn't. I have the book, and I checked. There's some complicated lore and math going on here with how much time passes before the creation of the sun and how the Eldar age. The short version is that in the first age, every Valian year, or tree year, was the equivalent of 144 solar years. The elves mature at a much slower rate than humans, and that rate changes over time. Just for some perspective, elven pregnancy lasted 9 Loa, 9 Valian months, or 9 solar years. Ladies, 9 years. That's enough to make even the most hardcore Christian pro-choice. As for Galadriel, Tolkien doesn't mention the year of Galadriel's birth, and there are several changes to the timeline which makes it hard to pin down her actual age in solar years. There are 2 different estimates given of her relative age, particularly when she leaves Middle-earth. However, Olsen is right that Tolkien says she's about 20 or 2,880 solar years old when she arrives to Middle-earth. The problem is that she comes to Middle-earth at the beginning of the first stage, not the second, which is when the show is set. Galadriel marries Celeborn near the end of the first stage, and then passes over the mountains into Eriador. She was about 26 at that time. When their daughter Celebrian is born, Galadriel was about 29. She didn't go back over the mountains until after her daughter is born, so we can assume that she's at least 29 or 30 when she finally makes her way into Lindon. So no, Tolkien didn't say she was 21 in the Second Age. If those scenes are flashbacks to Galadriel coming to Middle-earth, then your estimate would be accurate, although the scene would still be wrong since she didn't cross the Helcaraxe alone. It's amazing that you have the book in your hand and still got this wrong. Speaking of wrong,
Tolkien gave very little in the way of physical description. We actually know very little about even central characters. What color is Mary's hair? No idea. He never says.
But before the king could speak, the small smoke-breathing figure suddenly became aware of them as they sat there silent on the edge of the mist. He sprang to his feet. A young man he looked, or like one, though not much more than half a man in height. His head of brown curly hair was uncovered, but he was clad in the travel-stained cloak of the same hue and shape as the companions of Gandalf had worn when they rode to Edoras. He bowed very low, putting his hand upon his breast. Then, seeming not to observe the wizard and his friends, he turned to Eomer and the king. "Welcome, my lords, to Isengard," he said. "We are the door wardens. Meriadoc, son of Saradoc, is my name. The Two Towers, Book 3, Chapter 8, The Road to Isengard. Would you like to try again?"
Tolkien never even mentioned whether or not Aragorn has a beard.
This is true, but a very weird point to make. You're claiming that Tolkien doesn't tell us what characters look like, and you use Aragorn as an example, except Tolkien does describe him. Quote, "As Frodo drew near, he drew back his hood, showing a shaggy head of dark hair flecked with gray, and in a pale, stern face, a pair of keen gray eyes." So why are you focusing on the beard? Just because Tolkien doesn't mention whether Aragorn had a beard doesn't make his description not a description.
If somebody asked me the question, do I believe that Tolkien pictured most or all of these characters as light-skinned. I think that in his mind's eye, yes, he was picturing them as white.
If Tolkien's intentions were clear enough for you, who's about to contradict yourself, to get that these characters are white, then that should be the end of the discussion about the racial depiction of the characters. We all know that these characters are based on Europeans. There's no reason to pretend that they're not when Tolkien was very clear about his inspirations. All these races, from the elves to the men to the dwarves, are white, and there's nothing wrong with that, and no need to change it. Tolkien has the Easterlings and the Harad, who could be depicted as non-white, and since the Númenóreans sailed east constantly, it would make sense that they would encounter these people. Those could be the non-white cast in the show that you're looking for. But I'm sure you're going to come up with some nonsense that's so ridiculously wrong that Christopher Lee will slap you from his grave.
When he was doing his maps, for instance, he said things like, so Minas Tirith is about the latitude of central Italy, and Umbar, the city down in the south where the Southrons come from, is about the latitude of Carthage. So that means that Dol Amroth down on the southern shore of Gondor would have been about the latitude of like Morocco, southern Spain, perhaps. Do you want to be true to what you think Tolkien was probably imagining? Or do you want to be true to what Tolkien said about the world?
Do you mean this? Quote, as for the shape of the world of the Third Age, I am afraid that was devised dramatically rather than geologically or paleontologically. Or maybe this, quote, if Hobbiton and Rivendell are taken, as intended, to be at about the latitude of Oxford, then Minas Tirith, 600 miles south, is about the latitude of Florence. The mouths of Anduin and the ancient city of Peлагir are about at the latitude of ancient Troy. Or mayhap this, quote, those days, the Third Age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed. Are those what you mean? Because it seems like Tolkien is saying, don't assume the lands of Arda are one-for-one analogs for the lands of the actual Earth. I mean, that's what he said about the world, and you're all about listening to what he said. So are you going to listen to him?
Numenor is on the equator.
So that's a no.
So when we meet the Númenóreans, in theory, they will have been a culture living on the equator for thousands of years. I see no reason to think, based, from Tolkien's story, that they should be Viking-looking white folks.
This is a map of Arda. As you can see, it remained flat until the fall of Númenor at the end of the Second Age. If the world was flat, there was no equator. Númenor, as you can see, was flooded when Arda was made round, so it was gone when Ilúvatar created an equator. So you are wrong, sir. Twice. Because Tolkien stated that the Númenóreans were descendants of the Edain. As you admitted, Tolkien likely imagined all these men were white. So when they moved to Númenor, they'd still be white. Their race wouldn't magically change because they went to a hotter climate. This is further proved by their long lifespan. Númenóreans could live between 300 to 400 years at their prime, so the chances of them changing due to the climate would be much smaller, and they were initially less likely to mingle with other races of men. The clearest evidence of this is Aragorn, Faramir, and Boromir, all of whom have connections to the Númenóreans. They are all white. Now, Tolkien did consider making Arda round from the start in later writings, but he seems to have abandoned this and returned to the flat world theory. So your point is defied by what Tolkien actually wrote and the real world, where Europeans have moved to lands near the equator, like northern Brazil, and didn't change their race. They just got tanned. So that point you're trying to make about location and brown people, it's wrong.
I've seen a lot of people asking, and even some complaining, that Elrond doesn't have long flowing elvish hair. What's up with that?
No, it's a Peter Jackson thing. We don't know anything about elf hair. Again, we know something about the color of some of the elves' hair, but we know literally nothing about how long there's no reason to think that elves had long hair. There's no reason to think they had short hair either. But that is totally not a book detail. That is absolutely a movie thing.
You're right, because there totally isn't decades of art from before 2001 showing elves with long hair. Oh, wait, there is. Seems like lots of people assumed elves would have long hair because some of them, like Galadriel, were described as having long hair, and it's a common fantasy trope, not something Peter Jackson created.
What's the deal with everyone saying that dwarven women are meant to have beards? Is that from the books?
No.
Dís was a daughter of Thrain II. She is the only dwarf woman named in these histories. It was said by Gimli that there are few dwarf women, probably no more than a third of the whole people. They seldom walk abroad, except at great need. They are in voice and appearance, and in garb if they must go on a journey, so like to the dwarf men that the eyes and ears of other peoples cannot tell them apart. This has given rise to the foolish opinion among men that there are no dwarf women, and that the dwarves grow out of stone. The Return of the King, Appendices A, Durin's Folk. How are you this wrong? No, better question. How much did Amazon pay you to be this wrong?
Tolkien never says dwarven women have beards. He says they rarely wander around, and when they do, they're often mistaken for dwarven men, meaning like they keep to themselves and like you don't know that it's a woman. That they have beards is not in the text. It's a joke that Peter Jackson made and everybody loved.
Right. Dwarf women don't have beards and rarely go out, but when they do, they get mistaken for men because people don't know they're women. Why would they be mistaken for men? Tolkien describes how dwarves dress. They don't cover their faces because they're very proud of their beards. So if dwarf women don't have beards and they dress like the men, meaning they wouldn't cover their faces, wouldn't people see that the women don't have beards? Even if they sound like the men, wouldn't people notice this and ask about it, making the myth that there are no dwarf women pointless? Why lie and claim Tolkien never wrote about this? This is such a petty thing to lie about, and yet here you are doing just that, just lying for no good reason. Now, here's the kicker. When Olsen gets to a part of the teaser that strikes him as defying the lore, he has no problem pointing it out.
I have no idea what's going on here. She seems to be trying to pull him out of what and to where. I don't have too many Tolkien categories that would help me to explain what's going on here. There's only one recorded meteor in all of Tolkien, and no people are in it for sure. But there are two clear candidates. One would be a wizard. This would be a weird way for wizards to come to Middle-earth. Gandalf definitely does not arrive until the Third Age, and Saruman and Radagast. The other person, of course, that this could be is Sauron. That this is Sauron's move to disguise himself. I am like this angelic figure descended among you. Sauron is totally associated with fire, so he could obviously pull this off. The thing, if I'd say worries, the meteor crater worries me a little bit.
So now you have a problem with Amazon breaking the lore? You've supported all the other changes that defy what happens in the book, bending over backwards and even flat out lying to do it. But this being Gandalf or Sauron is a bridge too far? Why? If you're fine with Amazon compressing thousands of years of story, why take issue with them moving something from the Third Age? If you're fine with them reimagining Galadriel as She-Man, trans Prince of Power, why take issue with this being Gandalf or Sauron? No, it doesn't fit the lore, but you didn't have a problem with every other change you mentioned. So why does this scene bother you? Olsen doesn't give an answer, but I'll take a guess. It's because this change has nothing to do with progressive politics, so there's no risk in objecting to it. He either supports the politically based changes made for the show, or doesn't want to be called out for disagreeing. But since this change isn't based around that, he has no problem calling it out. I could be wrong about his motivations, but that's my best guess.
I'm very encouraged. I'm really liking what I am seeing so far. And the speculations, if the lines of speculation that the trailer is leading me into turn out, then I'll be pretty pleased. I think I see evidence that they're doing some really clever adaptation and some really thoughtful adaptation.
How long is it since Amazon bought you? What was the promised price? When all the Tolkien scholars are dead, you will take your share of their credit? Be silent. Keep your forked tongue behind your teeth. We haven't passed through moral majorities and wokeness to bandy crooked words with a witless worm. Watching Amazon try and fail to do damage control for the show is probably more entertaining than the show. Not since Star Wars have I seen the studio obliterate an easy win this badly. Disney screwed up so bad they made people praise the prequels. Amazon is screwed up so bad even the normies are like, nah. Y'all done messed up so bad, I wonder if y'all gonna let Stephen Colbert anywhere near this show. Cause if it sucks, you know he's probably gonna say something. That's how bad y'all done screwed up. You could have Peter Jackson endorse the show and people would still be like, thanks, I'll pass. I mean, that is a thing of special magnificence. As for Corey Olsen, we gonna need your Tolkien books. We ain't gonna keep them. We just gonna hold on to them until that Amazon money runs out and you find your fandom again. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.